Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Whiskey Uncorked, where today we are finally wrapping up our months-long look into the 18-year-old single malt Scotch category by looking at a much-anticipated release from earlier this year, the Port Charlotte 18. We are finally here after a couple months of exploring a category of single malt Scotch that frankly I wasn't super familiar with, and feeling like there was this big gap in my knowledge, and in particular in my ability to relate with many of you. We're finally here, and I have a much better understanding, although far from complete, but I have a much better understanding of this category of Scotch whiskey. The 18-year-old range was something that I largely ignored. At the beginning, I probably did what most people did and got into that kind of 10, 12-year-old age statement range from official bottlings, and pretty much jumped right into special releases, independent bottlings, and the like. So I felt that was a category that really needed to be explored a little bit for me to do this channel and to talk at least somewhat intelligently about some of the topics that I anticipated discussing on this channel. So I'll talk more about this in my wrap-up video, which will come out in a week or two from the release of this. Not exactly sure. I want to make sure that I've kind of got everything in my mind as to what I want to talk about and how I want to address those things. But as I've mentioned before, every single bottle that I reviewed through this series was my first experience with that particular whiskey. There was a couple that I had prior to starting this, like the Anik 18. I'd had that bottle for quite a while. I was pretty deep into the bottle, but most of these were brand new bottles. Either I had bought them previously and I was kind of waiting to get into them, or I picked them up specifically for this channel and this series. So I know that my experience with these bottles will continue to evolve over time. I'll get to know them better. The bottles will open up. Most of these reviews, I've been a third or a quarter of the way through the bottle when I did the reviews, and that might not have been the approach I would have liked to have taken, but I still gave my honest opinion as to what I thought of them at that time, and we'll see where I sit with these maybe in a year. But let's talk about this particular bottle. Similar to the Bruichladdich 18, which I reviewed earlier, this was part of that, at least for me, a big moment where we finally got some higher age stated whiskey out of the revived Bruichladdich distillery. We had gotten a 16-year-old Port Charlotte. It was a Fagio release. I think it was back in 2020. But outside of that, both Bruichladdich and Port Charlotte were limited to kind of that 10-ish year age stated releases in terms of their core range and their Isla Barleys and Bear Barley releases. Also in Port Charlotte, we got the Cask Exploration series where we get a release or so of that per year where they release their whiskey aged in specific types of barrels. Some of those had been excellent. So I was really excited to get a higher age-stated, higher ABV release from Port Charlotte. And yeah, let's jump into some specs on the bottle. So this is not a regular release. This is a special release. It's the 2024 edition of their 18-year-old. This is opposed to the Bruichladdich 18, which is meant to be a regularly available release. So there were only 6,000 bottles of this released globally. It is 100% Scottish barley, all from the mainland. The barley has been peated to 40 ppm, and the cask makeup is 74% refill sherry casks and 26% refill French oak wine casks. So as we've come to learn, doing a number of Bruichladdich reviews over the last few months since the beginning of this channel, Bruichladdich does seem to really love their refill casks. They tend to add a very subtle complexity and not going all in on these big, bold cask influences. Maybe the one exception to that is some of the releases in that Cask Exploration series from Port Charlotte. And many of those have turned out, at least in my opinion, fantastic. Now, I'm a little late to the party on this. This was released a couple months ago, and there have been a number of reviews on YouTube already. And just taking a quick look through those, this has gotten rave reviews. So when I finally was able to get this home, I was pretty excited to finally dig into it. And I could say there's going to be a lot of positive things said about this bottle as well. However, I did want to mention, I did take a quick look at Whiskey Base. Whiskey Base at times is good to kind of get a little bit broader of a swath of reviews. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of different folks on there leaving their own reviews, but mostly positive there as well. I did find a few reviews where they weren't as enthusiastic about it. Maybe there was some things that disappointed them to a degree, but generally speaking, the reception to this bottle has been extremely, extremely good. So as I mentioned in my previous reviews, and if you just take a look at the previous videos, I have been drinking quite a bit of heavily peated whiskey lately, and that doesn't even count the stuff that will probably be last drops reviews here coming up pretty soon, including a couple of other Bruichladdich bottles. And the reason I say that is I've got some pretty direct comparisons to this in terms of where I'm at with this right now compared to some of these other really, really good whiskeys that we've been reviewing recently. One of the other complaints about this bottle, or maybe one of the only complaints about this bottle, is the pricing. So this was released in the UK at an RRP of £175. And here in the US, it seems that the baseline price for this is about $200 plus tax. That would put those two prices probably perfectly in line. So you're going to be paying $210 to $220 out the door on this, provided you didn't have to pay shipping. I have seen this up as high as $300, although those bottles do still seem to be sitting on the shelf. And I believe I've seen maybe a person or two state that they were able to get it for less than $200. If you got it for less than $200, you got a good deal. Additionally, I did take a look, and it appears this is still available on the Bruichladdich website. It did let me add a bottle to my cart and go all the way up until the complete order button. And that bottle would have come out to 212 pounds after all of the tax adjustments and shipping, which would put it at just over $250, maybe $260, depending on where you live. So that makes this one of the more expensive bottles that we have reviewed on this channel, barring some of the outliers like the Springbank 18 and whatnot. So this has a pretty big bar to live up to. At that price point, you are starting to jump into a little bit, definitely more of a luxury pricing. However, as I mentioned, this is a higher ABV at 54.3%. So you are getting a little bit of extra punch there, and obviously it being heavily peated usually adds a bit of cost to the bottle as well. But let's see if this is able to live up to its price and the hype and give this thing some tasting notes. All right, as I mentioned, I was looking forward to this quite a bit. You guys know I'm a Bruichladdich fanboy. I always expect really good, or at the very least, very interesting things out of them. Let's see what I'm getting on the nose today. It's very fragrant. It's not super punchy, but you certainly get a full nose here, and it is pretty distinctly Bruichladdich. So one thing that I notice on this is I do get some of that Bruichladdich lactic quality. Now that's a note that is a bit of a chameleon. It can change, particularly in my experience as I go through the bottle. It can sometimes morph into more of a briny, seafood, oystery quality. But at least for right now, still early on in the bottle, it is coming off as that kind of classic Bruichladdich lactic note that I'm beginning to be able to identify pretty easily. Some other people might classify it as a bit of a cheesy nose. I never really picked it up that way, but we're all going to interpret it a little bit differently. All right, what else are we getting? So obviously being a heavily peated whiskey, probably one of the first things you're going to be wondering is how peaty is it? And this certainly hasn't lost a ton of its punch. It definitely may have had its kind of edges sanded. It's pretty round and kind of smooth nose feel, so to speak. But it definitely is a Port Charlotte. It's Bruichladdich. It's not quite Octomore, but at that higher ABV, you are getting a good punch of that kind of smoked meats, bacony, slightly ashy smoke that at least I tend to identify with whiskeys coming out of Bruichladdich. All right, see if we get anything else. So there's some sweetness here. It's caramel and toffee. There's some fresh ground black pepper. There's kind of an overall savory quality to it, maybe even some soy sauce and maybe some savory herbs. Fruit-wise, I would say this, I kind of had a hard time with the fruit. I think I've settled kind of on like plums and pineapples. It was kind of a general fruitiness, slightly citrus, slightly tropical, but the more I smelled it, the more times I drank it, I think I kind of narrowed it down. Although I think you could probably pick out a number of different fruits on here. But it's a well integrated fruitiness, so it's not just a big blast. Definitely some oak, maybe a slight floral quality, but very slight. And then yeah, a little bit of salty, streaky bacon. One thing that I realized with this whiskey, every time I drank it, I kind of got a little bit different experience. I pulled out some weird notes at times, maybe things that I wouldn't necessarily say I'm getting right now, but those first couple pours were very interesting. I think one time I kind of was getting a little bit of that kind of wet dumpster. I think it was that lactic note was maybe really strong. I said pumpkin pie with slightly burnt crust. I still see where that one came from. I think I could still pull that out of here with some of the spices that are in here, and then that kind of slightly savory quality from like a pumpkin pie. But overall, this nose is really, really nice. I really enjoy it. There's some more challenging flavors in here. This isn't going to be a big, sweet, fruity, just, crowd pleaser of a whiskey. There are some darker edges, like again, the smoke and the char and that savory quality, and you throw in that slightly tangy lactic note. It ends up with a very complex, very well integrated whiskey that still has identifiable layers that you can find and try to focus on. And to the point where I think you could give this whiskey to 5 different people and they're going to come up with some pretty distinct tasting notes all around, depending on their own personal experience. But I do really, really enjoy the nose on this one. If the palate matches up with the nose here, we are talking about a banger and the hype is real. So let's find out if that's true. Cheers. So similar to the nose, I think you can do some pretty direct translation from the nose to the palate. There are some complex, slightly challenging notes in here, but nothing that turns me off from the whiskey at all. And there's a lot of different sensations. This is one of those whiskeys that has some good sensation complexity, the flavor complexity, and definitely very layered. And you can kind of, with every sip, you can kind of focus on something a little bit different. So the mouthfeel is really nice. It's a clingy whiskey. It definitely sticks to the roof of your mouth. You can taste this for a long time. The finish length is nice. It lingers for a long time. You get some good flavor and it kind of slowly dies, and you're left with a nice oaky base. Outside of that, up front, you are getting your sweeter notes, and that's where I can pick up that lactic note sometimes. It seems like if I take a bigger sip, I don't get it as much, but you're getting your caramels and vanillas up front, and then it develops into the big peaty meat of the experience. All right, let's go in for a second sip. So that smokiness is definitely a little campfire-y. In fact, it's not really campfire. It's kind of mesquite. It kind of has that, it's a barbecue pit. It's like walking past someone smoking meat and just getting a big whiff of that smoke. It's a little bit sweet. It's a little bit savory. And you can get kind of some of that salty bacon quality really throughout the entire experience. There is still some malt character available here. It hasn't been completely overrun by the peat and the casks and the thyme. So some nougat on the back. I don't really get too much chocolate, maybe just a touch on the finish. But overall, I would say this is a fairly spicy whiskey. There's some baking spices, there's a pepperiness, and oak spice, the whole thing. I can feel my entire tongue still tingling, maybe partly from the ABV, but I don't think it drinks hot. It definitely is bringing a little bit more than your 46%ers. But remember, the Port Charlotte 10 is still released at 50%, so this isn't that much higher, just that 4.3% higher. But I never really felt compelled to add water to this. I will at some point, but with peated whiskeys, I tend to not add water, at least unless I'm like kind of forcing myself to. Generally speaking, I'm going to kind of take those for what they are. Fruit-wise, again, probably maybe less identifiably fruity on the palate, and it is, again, a little bit more of a general fruitiness. I'm sure maybe some people with some more sensitive palates are going to be able to pick out more specific things. I think the plum on the nose is probably more of what I'm getting, but the other flavors are big enough where that's a pretty subtle aspect. All right, one more sip to look at the finish, and we'll get into my scoring and my overall thoughts. Cheers. So yeah, there is that oaky quality that really permeates throughout. It doesn't bother me at all. I don't feel it being over oaked or anything like that, but you can tell it spent 18 years in a cask and it's a high proofer, but that really carries through into the finish and lingers throughout. Again, spicy overall, more of a white pepper on the finish, and oak spice a lot. There's not too much bitterness. The bitterness really comes out really late into the finish, where it's just kind of lingering, and you might kind of get some of that oaky tannin quality that's kind of left over. But a lot of salt and pepper on the finish. The brininess really kind of picks up there as some of the other notes start to dissipate. And as I mentioned, it's a pretty good length. You can really kind of sit here and just keep experiencing the whiskey pretty accurately throughout. As I said, the finish slowly dies, and then you start to get a little bit more of that bitterness, ashy bitterness, oak tannins, that sort of thing. So overall, no question that this is a banger. I definitely see why a lot of people absolutely love this. In terms of me just kind of trying to determine like how much do I really like this, I think I found maybe wanting a slightly more detectable richness. Maybe it's that the Lechek that I gave a 9. Maybe I'm still thinking about that. Had a little bit of a molasses. This does have some toffee on it, but to kind of keep things from being a little bit too kind of bright and salty and spicy. But maybe that would help a little bit, but it's not what it is, so I'm not going to pay too much attention to what it's not. Overall, how I would describe this is a kind of, it's sweet and salty, it is savory, it's a little bit tart, even a touch of bitterness at the end. So you're really covering the whole gamut. It's a very complex whiskey overall, and I think this is really going to come down to what type of whiskey do you like to drink. If you're looking for a big desserty whiskey with big influence of sherry, port casks, more similar to the Cask Exploration series, that's probably not what you're going to find here. As I mentioned, that you're getting savory, you are getting spicy. There are some brighter notes that kind of come in that lactic quality, some tang, and just the general brininess of the whiskey overall. Definitely not a dessert whiskey, but highly complex. And I can't really find anything negative to say about it, although it may not be for everybody. So I think in terms of a score, I'm a pretty solid 8 out of 10. The Lechek 18 that got a 9 just was something that was just comforting and just hit a lot of spots for me. This is more, I feel like this is going to be more of an advanced, heavily peated whiskey for sure. And I thoroughly enjoy it. However, I feel like I'm going to want to drink this, at least where I'm at in the bottle now. We'll see how it develops over time. But when I drink this, I'm going to really want to be sitting down and focusing on it and thinking about it and going through all of those layers of flavors and sensations. So it's difficult to decide like how to score it. But yeah, I think for right now, I'm going to stick with an 8 out of 10, which is very good. But I could definitely see this being another one of these whiskeys. And there have been a few of them. As I mentioned, I'm not super deep into a lot of these, but that could jump up into the 9 once maybe my brain gets wrapped around it a little bit more. But this is a fantastic whiskey, and the hype is justified, provided you know what you're getting into. So in terms of value, again, another one. If either A, you're gonna have zero problems paying this price because you know what you're getting and you know how you feel about Port Charlotte and maybe Bruichladdich character overall. Obviously, this is on the higher end of the 18-year-old category, higher ABV, limited release. The oldest Port Charlotte we've had released to us, at least as an official bottling. I think I understand why it was priced at what it was. I think this is definitely one of these, similar to maybe like the Springbanks or the Long Rose, that sort of thing. If you bought one of these, you were probably super excited to get it, and you're not going to take too many $200 stabs in the dark. You probably understood or had an expectation of what you were going to be getting. And I'm going to guess that most of you that bought this have no regrets, and neither do I. So just a summarized value, probably don't want to see these bottles creep up too much more. You're really starting to push maybe some big fans of the Port Charlotte 10. There's going to be a lot of people who love the Port Charlotte 10 and are going to see the price of this and probably feel upset or disappointed that they're not going to be able to justify the price. And they would have loved to have gotten to try some older Port Charlotte, but it's the world we live in at this point in time, especially with all the good reviews. It probably just exacerbates the problem as it is. But this is the price of admission these days for a whiskey like this, particularly with a first release. Maybe in the future, as maybe Bruichladdich is able to catch up with stocks, maybe it's not a quote-unquote special release. Maybe we get a standard 50% version of this at some point. With maybe a slightly more inline pricing. Obviously, the Bruichladdich 18 was only $190, which was only $10 less than this. Obviously, unpeated and a lower ABV by a little bit. So probably not. We're probably going to see these, hopefully, just at least stick at this price range for a little while, and not increase too much more, and just kind of let the world catch up a little bit. But who knows? It's a crazy world out there, and definitely an interesting data point for the overall look back, the overall retrospective, looking back at these 18-year-old whiskeys that we've been reviewing and kind of where they all sit in the larger landscape of Scotch single malt in 2024. So definitely look out for my retrospective video. I'm looking forward to doing it. I've got a bunch of notes. I'm still trying to organize all of my thoughts and all the topics I want to hit, make sure that it's not a 4-hour long thing. It will be posted as a podcast. It will be posted to Spotify, Amazon, Apple Music, all that stuff. So if you want to listen to it in your car, great. Additionally, I think hopefully there's going to be another podcast episode. We're going to see if we can get Kevin online, and we'll just kind of talk about some of the recent things that have been going on, and update a few things that we had been talking about previously, and just to have a pretty laid back conversation about single malt Scotch. But until then, I wanted to thank everyone. If you've been watching this 18-year-old single malt series, I am more thankful than I could possibly say in words that you've been sticking with me. Your comments have all been really great, super supportive, and I'm really looking forward to kind of going through my thoughts in depth and maybe putting my feet up and having an interesting dram or two while I do so. If you're interested in watching more of my content, please hit the subscribe button. If you have thoughts about this whiskey, please leave a comment below. And if you thought there was at least something interesting or engaging about the video, please leave a like. But until then, expect more content from me coming out soon. And before I log off, I did mention, I think in the Lechick video, I do plan on posting just kind of a standalone kind of channel update video. Not necessarily an update video, but more soliciting your advice for what you would like to see in this channel, at least over the next few months as we get into the summer and things slow down a little bit. But definitely going to be interested in your feedback there, so keep an eye out for that. But until next time, thank you so much for watching. Cheers.